Israel has no good options. That is the thesis of today's video, and I'm going to explain why I think that. Hey everybody, I am Isaac Saul and welcome back to the Tangle YouTube channel. As you might notice, we're in a little bit of a different space. This is our first ever video in the new studio. Very excited to bring you guys a lot of fresh content. But today we're going to be talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, what's happening in Gaza right now, and what Israel's options are going forward. Obviously, not a very uplifting subject. I want to start by saying that I've seen more interest in what is happening in Israel and Gaza than just about anything else we've covered in the 4 years since I started at Tangle. It is coincidentally also a topic I care a great deal about personally and have a lot of interest in and have been following for a long time. Over the last few weeks, I've gotten two broad sets of questions over and over again. One of them is, what options does Israel really have? And the other one is, what are some good resources to learn more about this conflict? So today I'm going to try and answer the first question. What options does Israel have? And then in the episode description, I'm going to leave some resources for you all if you want to dive deeper on the Israel-Palestine conflict and what's happening in Gaza. So we're going to start with Israel's options. The headline of this YouTube video is the thesis of my position. Israel has no good options. In arguing this thesis, I won't be making an argument for blame. The fact that Israel has no good options could be blamed on the last few decades of Israel's policies, or even the concept of Israel in the first place. It could also be blamed on the current state of Palestinian leadership, Hamas's attack, and the nature of the Palestinian liberation movement. Obviously, many folks on the pro-Palestine and pro-Israel side of this issue are making and will continue to make those arguments. I'm not here today trying to make the case one way or another. Instead, I just want to share my thoughts in an attempt to speak realistically about the current situation on the ground, what lies ahead, and the proposals that I'm seeing out there from across the political spectrum. Since Hamas's attack, I've heard many different arguments that I think can be broadly bucketed into three main categories. The first one is that Israel should destroy Hamas. They should respond militarily with an air bombardment and ground invasion. That is basically the response we appear to be witnessing right now. The second one is that Israel should not respond with a full-on military invasion, but focus on the long-term peace process. That's the response coming from a lot of centrists and moderates, and that's basically what they're calling for. The third response is that Israel should recognize that Hamas's attack is a product of Israel's blockade and occupation, so it should cease military operations, end the blockade in Gaza, and withdraw from the West Bank. That is the response many pro-Palestinian advocates and Western leftists are calling for. So we're going to take a look at each of those strategies one by one, and I'm going to explain why I think all of them are bad options. First, we're going to start with the strategy that we are witnessing right now. Israel should destroy Hamas. They should respond militarily with an air bombardment and ground invasion. And that is obviously what we're watching right now. Best I can tell, this is the response Israel is pursuing. From Israel's point of view, the upside of this response is clear. If it can kill enough Hamas leaders and or destroy enough of Hamas's infrastructure, Hamas could go the way of al-Qaeda, lose power, lose influence, lose the capability to perform the kind of attacks that it executed on October 7th. This is also a deterrent option. Show Hamas and the Arab world that any attack on Israel will be met with overwhelming force, and hope the response dissuades potential enemies like Iran from attacking. In short, Israel should demonstrate its strength.
If you want peace, destroy Hamas. If you want security, destroy Hamas. If you want a future for Israel, the Palestinians, the Middle East, destroy Hamas.
So why is it not a good option? There are a lot of reasons, the largest of which is the destruction this plan will wreak on all of Gaza. Given the nature of Gaza, the human cost of this option is incalculably high. The Gaza Health Ministry has tallied 8,000 deaths since the start of the fighting, and it claims that half of them are children. The civilian death toll in Gaza is nearly impossible to pinpoint, and everyone should be skeptical of the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. I wrote about this last week. But in this case, there is good reason to believe their numbers are close to accurate. One reason to believe the Gaza Health Ministry is that in past conflicts, its totals have largely been confirmed by the United Nations, independent human rights organizations, and independent reporting. The Health Ministry has listed the names of every person who has been killed since October 7th and says they track them by identifying bodies that arrive at Gaza's hospitals, recording their names, official ID numbers, age, and sex. Importantly, the database does not record whether they were civilians or militants, but it also doesn't count people who are buried by their families, not recovered from the rubble, or not brought to the hospitals. Because of that, news outlets like The Economist that have analyzed the numbers suggest the number, if anything, is actually an undercount of the total dead. No matter whether you believe those numbers are too high or too low, though, one thing is clear. A lot of civilians are dying, including at least hundreds and probably thousands of children. This is a horrific tragedy on its own. On top of being devastating for the Palestinian people, it's also bad politically for Israel, whose global image is going to suffer because of the war. The deterioration of that image will cost Israel allies and political support in the West, while further inflaming tensions among its adversaries. This approach creates a lot of other problems too. For one, Israel is going to create a humanitarian disaster by pushing refugees into southern Gaza and potentially into Egypt. We have some evidence that is precisely what Israel wants. This war has already destroyed a huge chunk of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza, and whatever towns are left will be much worse off than they were before. As we've seen throughout history, bad conditions in Gaza often create a less stable environment on Israel's borders. Second, Israel is beginning its ground invasion, which will be unlike any war we've ever seen. This kind of urban warfare is always dangerous, and many Israeli soldiers are likely to die, but it would be especially perilous in Gaza, where Hamas has hundreds of miles of underground tunnels, more than 200 hostages, and militant soldiers who are ready to die for their cause. If Israel pursues this ground invasion, as it appears they are, its army is going to be fighting in unthinkably difficult conditions. Third, Israel's invasion has the potential to lead to a larger regional war. Iran has already suggested it would get involved. Yemen's Houthi rebels are already launching missiles at Israel. Hezbollah is firing rockets to Israel from Lebanon. The situation is deteriorating fast, and it seems possible, if not likely, that other regional powers, as well as the United States, will soon be dragged into a hot war. Finally, this strategy would be far from novel. Everyone knows the cliche about the definition of insanity, but Israel's decision to respond militarily is precisely the same decision it has made at similar moments in the past. Responding with military forces only succeeded to perpetuate the cycle of violence, but not to meaningfully change the peace process. As Israel advances in Gaza, it will necessarily have to occupy the territory behind it to protect its forces, which means we're going to be watching the slow-motion reoccupation of Gaza moving backward toward the situation we had in 2005. As Palestinian writer Youssef Munayyer has argued, it's quite possible that there is not a military option that will improve the situation. The reality is that there seems to be a never-ending supply of purported Hamas leaders for Israel to kill, and if the stated goal is destroying Hamas, Israel's going to be fighting for a largely ambiguous and arbitrary outcome. Of course, for every bomb that Israel drops on Gaza, every family who experiences someone being killed, every negative interaction between an Israeli soldier and a Palestinian, a new anti-Israel radical is born. This war, like the 1967 war or the 1948 war, or all the spates of violence in the early 21st century, is almost certainly going to create a whole new crop of Israelis and Palestinians who hate each other. And if you want peace, that is one of the most discouraging realities about option number one. All right, next up is option number two, which is Israel should not respond with a full-on military invasion, but focus on the long-term peace process. This is the response some centrists and moderates are calling for. From the more centrist point of view, this argument is effectively that Israel has a right to respond militarily, but it must do so with restraint. Any actions taken now must center long-term peace with Palestine and keep the potential two-state solution alive. Generally, the idea is to accept Israel's right to defend itself without endorsing the kind of military response that will kill civilians or significantly reduce the chance for long-term peace. Many folks in this camp believe Israel has already crossed the line and advocate for restraint because they believe the continuance of this military operation could lead to a wider regional conflict. So, why is it not a good option? Well, circumstantially, you can tell it's not a good option because most of the people calling for it are the ones most removed from the situation. It's easy to argue for number two if you don't live in Israel or Gaza, and it's especially easy to call for this option if you want to remain in the middle. Practically speaking, though, this approach has a lot of problems. For one, Hamas is a genuine terrorist organization hell-bent on the destruction of Jews in Israel. We should take Hamas seriously and literally. Hamas's officials are making it very clear they will repeat the attacks of October 7th whenever they get a chance, and they believe everything they are doing is justified.
إسرائيل دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا. إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها لأنه بالفعل هي تعتبر كارثة أمنية وعسكرية وسياسية للأمة العربية والإسلامية، يجب أن تنتهي. لذلك احنا لا نخجل من نقول ذلك بكل قوة. انه اسرائيل لازم نأدبها، وحنأدبها مره ثانيه وثالثه، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الاقصى اول مره، لا حتكون ثانيه وثالثه ورابعه، لانه احنا لدينا اصرار ولدينا قرار ولدينا امكانيات ان نقاتل
نعم.
وان نحارب. لكن كما قلت لك بدنا ندفع ثمن. نعم احنا مستعدين، معلش بدي اقول لك بشكل واضح، احنا اسمنا شعب الشهداء وبنفخر ان نقدم شهداء. احنا لا نريد ان نمس لا بالمدنيين ولا ان نلحق الاذى بهم، لكن اوقات لانه في تعقيدات في الميدان صارت في منطقة موجودة، وكان هناك في احتفال وكان في سكان وفي منطقة واسعة ليست سهلة على امتداد تقريبا 40 كيلومتر. يجب أن ننتهي.
أن ينتهي وين؟ بقطاع غزة؟
ينتهي إلى، لا بتكلم عنه كل الأراضي الفلسطينية.
كل الأراضي الفلسطينية، يعني زوال طبعا. إسرائيل؟
طبعا. وجود إسرائيل غير منطقي. وجود إسرائيل هو اللي بخلق كل هذه الآلام والعذابات والدموع والدماء. هي إسرائيل مش احنا ضحية الاحتلال، نقطة واخر السطر. لذلك ما حدا يلومنا، احنا شو اللي بنعمله في 7 أكتوبر، في 10 أكتوبر، في مليون أكتوبر، احنا اللي بنعمله مبرر. It is justified، مبررة.
That clarity from its leaders is a good reminder of why calls for a ceasefire are so fraught. Hamas will use any ceasefire to continue plotting against Israel. Not only that, but Israel accepting a ceasefire would send a signal to Hamas that they can commit the atrocities they committed, killing 1,400 Israelis, and not expect it to result in the devastation of their own land and people. The militants who died in the attack will be martyred and valorized. Hamas will plan the next attack, and Israel, already fractured and apparently vulnerable, will come out weaker on the other side. It's also important to understand the regional significance of this moment. Broadly speaking, the power struggle in the Middle East is now between Iran, with its proxies in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Gaza, and Israel, with its ally, the United States, and Arab states like Egypt or Saudi Arabia that are in constant power struggles with the Iranian regime. This is a tremendously complex situation, but Iran is obviously on the offensive in the region. The idea that Israel would pull back, stop fighting, or move toward a ceasefire while Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthi rebels in Yemen are all firing on it is hard to rationalize. The simple calculation for Israel is stop now and Hamas remains in power and Iran is emboldened. Fight this war now and perhaps you end Hamas's grip on Gaza and deter Iran. Optimistically, the latter opens the door for the Arab world to usher in a new era of leadership, perhaps one that is more open to a peace process that doesn't involve extremism. Pessimistically, it just creates another power vacuum that gives rise to the next iteration of Hamas and a new unknown. Then there is also the issue of the over 200 hostages. Hamas has already turned a few hostages back over, and Israel has reportedly freed one through military action. Leaving the hostages in Gaza, i.e. not invading and trying to rescue them, will make Israel vulnerable to prisoner exchanges and negotiations with Hamas. In the past, Israel has valued a single Israeli prisoner as equivalent to hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, which means any hostage exchange could lead to the release of thousands of Palestinians being held by Israel. That puts Israel in a position of weakness, all while dealing with a group, Hamas, that has made it clear they will execute the hostages if Israel doesn't follow their orders. All right, so that is it for option number 2 and why it is not a great option for Israel. Before we jump into option number 3, I just want to tell you that if you are enjoying this channel or appreciating at all what we're doing here at Tangle, please give us a like, subscribe to the channel, be sure to turn on notifications, and let your friends know about Tangle. We are trying to get the word out about this YouTube channel. So take 20 seconds when you're done watching this video, or do it right now, and just share this channel with people you might think are interested in our content, or share this particular video with any of your friends that have been talking about this conflict. All right, the third and final option is to recognize that Hamas's attack is a product of Israel's blockade and occupation, so Israel should end the blockade in Gaza, withdraw from the West Bank, and that's the response many pro-Palestinian advocates and Western leftists want. Best I can tell, this is the consensus from the pro-Palestine side. From their point of view, the upside is clear. The root cause of Hamas's violence is years of expanding Israeli territory, the conditions in Gaza and the West Bank, and Israel's bombing and violence against Palestinians, all of which results in the radicalization of the population. If you want to do something to end the cycle of violence, you should end the cycle of violence. And given that Palestinians are simply asking to be free from Israeli occupation and blockades, ending those policies will give Hamas less reasons to fight. So why is it not a good option? Well, the first problem with this is that any government needs to prioritize the safety of its citizens, and no government that I can think of in the world would respond to an attack like the one that occurred on October 7th by relaxing security protocols and making it easier for such an attack to happen again. Like it or not, the reality is that both Gaza and the West Bank contain extremist groups who are ready to commit acts of terrorism in the name of self-defense and Palestinian freedom. Even with the blockades and security measures in place, there have been dozens of terrorist attacks in Israel this year. If those extremists are able to freely cross from Gaza or the West Bank, it is guaranteed we will see attacks on Israelis and Jews throughout the country go up. In short, it would be totally irrational for Israel to respond to the deadliest attack in its history, which occurred through an incursion on its borders, by making its border more porous. Just as with number 2, another big downside to this idea is simply the timing. Lifting the blockade now would just be rewarding Hamas for a terrorist act. It could ensure Hamas's control of Gaza for another generation and win them the hearts of the Palestinian people for the foreseeable future. It would teach Hamas that by indiscriminately killing Israelis in the most heinous way possible, they can still end up with international support and get what they want from Israel. To many Palestinians, Hamas would be heroes. They'd be the group that finally broke the blockade and rid the territories of Israel, all through a cunning surprise terrorist attack. This strategy has other geopolitical drawbacks too. For one, while lifting the blockade or ending the West Bank occupation could dramatically improve living conditions for Palestinians, it would also better connect Hamas to partners in the Arab world like Iran. It wouldn't just mean more food and economic opportunity, it would also mean weapons and resources flowing to Hamas leadership. Again, if you're an Israeli official standing across from the Hamas leadership having just witnessed what they did, this is an entirely unacceptable outcome. It's also worth pointing out that a total Israeli withdrawal from the Palestinian territories after this attack would necessitate the creation of independent leadership in those territories. Even in a best-case scenario where Gaza had its first election since 2006, considering the soft support for Hamas right now, I think it is fair to expect Hamas to win any election in the wake of Israel retreating from its blockade and occupation. Interestingly, Hamas being legitimized in this way wouldn't just be unacceptable to Israel, but also to many leaders in the Arab world. All of this is why so many people rightly insist that Hamas isn't just hurting Israel, it's hurting the Palestinian cause. All right, before we get out of here, I want to just make one additional point, which is, why is it like this? This dynamic is comfortable for leaders of both sides, and it affirms their positions. Israel can say convincingly that Gaza is being led by a barbaric terrorist organization that slaughters babies and children. Hamas can tell Gazans convincingly that Israel doesn't care how many Palestinians they kill, and therefore does not value Palestinian life. The dysfunctional status quo perfectly fits the worldview of opposing sides in the US, too. The American left can frame Israel as a genocidal colonizer. The American right can frame Palestinians as terrorists and extremists. Even many Arab leaders can feel assured they were right about Hamas or Israel, depending on which side of the conflict they've taken in recent years. What do the Palestinian people get? More of the same: poor living conditions, bombs overhead, and a new coming era of occupation. What do the Israeli people get? More of the same: threats of terrorism, more rockets coming from Gaza and Lebanon, increased anxiety about its neighbors. I say this because I think it is genuinely important to recognize, as awful as this situation is for so many people involved in this conflict, everything about it comfortably affirms everyone's prior beliefs on who is right and who is wrong in this dynamic, which to me seems especially dangerous because it pushes everyone toward repeating the same actions and mistakes of the past that got us here. So what are my solutions? Again, I regret to inform you, I don't really have any. I have opinions. Yes, I think Netanyahu is a failed leader in nearly every way, and I think Israel should move swiftly to remove him from power. I think the Arab world, especially Egypt and Jordan, need to do more for the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, and for the refugees this conflict is creating. I think it is entirely unacceptable to allow Hamas to remain in power in Gaza. I think what Israeli settlers are doing in the West Bank right now, rather quietly, is a gross violation of Palestinian rights and international law, and it is going to worsen this conflict. I think 2 decades of American policy vis-a-vis Iran has clearly failed. I think a regional war isn't just coming, it is, as evidenced by all the parties currently involved in this fighting, already here. Similarly, Israel's ground invasion is already here too. It's happening right now. But solutions, they're sparse. I rack my brains for ways out of this mess, and all I ever do is go down new paths and run headfirst into a brick wall. It feels like every option forward has downsides that outweigh the upsides, and I've lost a grip on what is even possible in this current political moment. I do know, of course, that I want to see the violence stop. I can't stomach the death in Gaza, the attacks on Israel, or the violence in the West Bank, but I have no idea how to get there in a way that doesn't also consequently lead to more instability and violence down the road. All right, with that very uplifting ending, that is it for today's video. A reminder, many of you have been asking for extra resources to learn more about this conflict. I've left some of those in the episode descriptions, some books, some podcasts, some articles that I would recommend. Also, before you get out of here, again, don't forget, if this video taught you something, if you learned something, if you felt like it was maybe rational or even handed as we try to be, please feel free to share it. We encourage you to spread the word about Tangle. And if you want this kind of stuff in your inbox every day, you can subscribe to the Tangle newsletter by going to readtangle.com. We'll be back here soon with another video, and I hope all of you are staying safe out there. Have a good one. Peace.